I want to welcome you and I want to thank, first of all, the Dean's Office for supporting this event. And I want to thank the ILS for helping get the word out and for throwing their weight behind it as well. I want to especially thank our speaker today, Professor Bhala. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce him to you today. I can think of no scholar active in the United States today that would be more suited to today's topic than Professor Bhala. To cite his numerous accomplishments in full would be to take up most of the time that's allotted for his lecture. So I will limit myself to noting that among his 13 books and more than 100 articles, he published last year a volume on U.S.-China trade entitled Trade War: Causes, Conduct, and Consequences of Sino-American Confrontation. His definitive article on China's entry into the WTO, Enter the Dragon, has been widely excerpted, including in the casebook that I assigned to my global business law students. So for those of you here from that class, this is a Meet the Author session. His work has responded to and helped define virtually every significant event and evolution in contemporary trade law. And his restless curiosity has also led him to subjects as diverse as law and literature. He's currently working on a project involving Shakespeare and the law, and Islamic law, where he was the first English language author to write a law book on Islamic law, at a time when the global environment could not have been less hospitable to such an enterprise. Currently, Professor Bhala holds the, I'm going to say, Bernese Distinguished Professorship at Kansas University. When he is there, he lectures and consults widely around the globe. Finally, Raj has been a friend and colleague of mine since the beginning of my academic career. So I'm immensely proud and pleased to present him to you today. He'll speak for about 45 minutes or so, I'd say, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Garcia, Frank. All of you in the audience at Boston College Law School, and all of you who are here by Zoom. It's a great honor and privilege to get to speak with you. And I'm so grateful to my longstanding friend and someone from whom I've learned a very great deal about international law. And that's, of course, your teacher and mine, Frank Garcia. We have known each other for, I think, more years than some of you in the audience have been alive. And it's just been a remarkable professional and personal friendship, and our families know each other and have visited each other. So it's just really great to be with you. So thank you. My plan is to speak, as Frank mentioned, Professor Garcia mentioned, for 45 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions and comments, especially in this environment. Before explaining what my thesis is, I want to stress that all of my comments are intended to be non-partisan and not ad hominem. They're intended to be analytical, critical, but in no way take aim at any political party or any personality. Now, my thesis is basically, you could say, two parts. The first is that President Trump and his America First trade policy do not happen ex nihilo. They did not occur out of nothing. They're not born out of nothing, Mr. Trump or his America First movement. They rather reflect a long evolution in American trade policy and the frustrations that have come with that policy. And so I'm going to chronicle that. And I'm going to explain then how do we get to where we are now. And then the second prong of the thesis that I'd like to present to you is that the current paradigm of international trade, of global trade, of American trade policy that we are in is what I would call aggressive neo-mercantilism. And I don't like inventing new academic jargon, so I'm going to explain what I mean by aggressive neo-mercantilism. So if you put the two prongs together, what I'm trying to say is that America First trade policy and its avatar, Mr. Trump, are not coming out of nothing, and they have led us to where we are now, which is a paradigm of aggressive neo-mercantilism. Now, to the starting point, and you can start, of course, back millennia with the Plutarch-Horace debate about free trade. But let's start a little bit more recently with China's entry into the WTO on the 11th of December of 2001. And Professor Garcia kindly mentioned my article about Enter the Dragon. So I won't spend too much time on that and certainly not go over the accession commitments. But what we have seen since that entry of China to the WTO, and if you date back a little bit further, January 1st, 1994, when the North American Free Trade Agreement, its first iteration, NAFTA 1.0, entered into force, we've seen a decline in American employment, particularly in manufacturing, of about 2 million jobs. And the numbers, vary a little bit, but about 2 million. The pro-America First trade policy people have been targeting China for blame that those jobs have been lost in America's manufacturing sector as the U.S. integrated more with its Canadian and Mexican partners through NAFTA, and as China entered more into the World Trading System by getting most favored nation treatment, MFN treatment, once it joined GATT and became a producing, exporting powerhouse benefiting from MFN treatment. Now, the reality is that most of those jobs are not necessarily lost because of trade, but rather because of technology, that workers have not, or management, have not been able to keep up technologically with change. And we've seen increased use of robots and artificial intelligence in manufacturing. So the causation that trade is to blame and that China is to blame in particular is somewhat dubious, but nonetheless, that narrative has taken over. Now, successive administrations, that is the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, they have all sought in one way or another to manage the rise of China in a way that would not cause so much adjustment costs to U.S. workers. So we've seen a strategy of negotiation, many series of strategic dialogues between the U.S. and China to try and manage trade relations. We've also seen a litigation strategy, especially during the Obama administration, where the U.S. would sue China under the dispute settlement understanding of the WTO, the DSU, and win many cases. For example, even on the tire safeguards case. The idea would be, well, let's get China to play by the rules through negotiation and through litigation, because China is somehow not playing by the rules. And the perception became more and more that China's made in 2025 industrial policy was at the core of the disruption to US-China trade relations. And if we look at that Made in China 2025 industrial policy, what we see is the Chinese Communist Party has very aggressive market share targets on approximately 10, 11 strategic sectors, including artificial intelligence, agriculture and agricultural machinery, chips, aircraft, and these are all sectors that are either directly related to the military or they're dual civilian military use. And they call for X% of chips being used in cell phones by 2025. And that X% is, 40, 50, 90%, depending on exactly what sector we're talking about and what product we're talking about. And those should be made in China. And so by the time we get to the campaign of 2015, the candidate Trump is sort of seeing a few decades almost of failed, or what's perceived to be failed American trade policy towards China. The trade deficit with China bilateral is exploding. Now, there's a separate question of whether or not we should care about bilateral trade deficits, whether they really matter. There's this threat that the Chinese are posing across the 9-dash line, claiming something like 90% of the South China Sea, through which 50% of world trade passes, and passes through waters of our allies like the Philippines. And it affects even non-claimants like Singapore, which have deep water ports. Port of Singapore Authority relies on freedom of navigation through the South China Sea. We're seeing increased threats to Taiwan. So by the People's Liberation Army. So by 2015, and then when candidate Trump wins in 2016 and enters into office in 2017, it's a logical evolution for the Trump administration, the first one, to launch the investigation under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 that looks at the acts, policies, and practices of the Chinese government and whether they are discriminatory or unreasonable and whether they burden or restrict U.S. commerce. And you international trade law students will know that I'm using the statutory language for 301. And of course, in March 2018, we get almost a foregone conclusion that the Section 301 report that the U.S. Trade Representative has put out is nailing China for its Made in China 2025 industrial policy and for its theft of U.S. intellectual property, its forced technology transfer on trade secrets, and its cyber attacks. And that Section 301 report is updated about a year later by the USTR, confirming all the initial points. And Peter Navarro, who of course is back in the administration as in basically the same position as White House trade advisor in the second trade administration, he's heading up in the first trade administration the trade and manufacturing office, and he is basically saying then as a now that yes, that China is to blame, and he's got a book Death by China. So all of this is kind of a natural progression from trying the negotiating strategy, trying the litigation strategy, and looking at aggressive moves militarily, politically, economically by China. And they lead in March 2018 to the launch of the trade war, which means the levying of basically 25% tariffs on about 300 billion of 500 billion worth of Chinese merchandise. That is to say, about 2/3 to 3/4 of all Chinese merchandise is tariffed by the US in 4 waves. Waves 1, waves 2, waves 3, and waves 4. Wave 4 is not yet complete. It's divided into list A and list B. We can talk about that. But so the Biden administration doesn't change any of that. In fact, the Biden administration, roughly a year ago, not only reaffirms the launch of the trade war and the prosecution of the trade war by the Trump administration, but actually increases tariffs on China upwards of in some cases to 100%. And in fact, one narrative is that Biden administration trade policy is Trump administration trade policy, but with a difference in tone. So when you see the Trump administration call trade policy America First, which it did in its first administration, and when it did again with its inauguration day 2025 America First trade policy memo, the Biden administration called it a worker-friendly trade policy to try and make trade work for American workers. And if I may be critical again without being ad hominem or nonpartisan, I think one of the reasons why you see such aggressive neo-mercantilism, as I'll get to in a few minutes, from the second Trump administration is the utter lackluster trade policy during the Biden interregnum. For 4 years, nothing happened. The Biden administration did not seek presidential trade negotiating authority when it expired in July of 2021. It tried to put together an Indo-Pacific economic framework, couldn't even really get India to participate in it in any major way. There were no market access commitments with IPEF. And for 4 years, there was just drift in trade policy. So you get in the campaign, presidential election campaign of 2024, the Trump people saying, well, look, nothing's happened and China's still a threat. And in fact, they expand that view of the US being taken advantage of, so I'll say in a minute, to Canada, to Mexico, to the European Union, and indeed the rest of the world. So this is a rather natural evolution. Again, Mr. Trump doesn't appear ex nihilo. Now, you also see from the title of the talk, he's a clever catalyst because he has catalyzed some new kinds of tariffs or tariff threats that we're going to see. And that's pretty dramatic. But again, we've got this evolution in trade policy that where we are now. So what have we seen since Inauguration Day, January 20th, in hardly the last 5 weeks? Well, for those of us who do this every day, as Frank knows, this is a 24/7 job. I mean, I definitely am checking, and I probably shouldn't be to get a good sleep, but I'm checking Bloomberg or Reuters or AP in the middle of the night to see what announcement has come. And we just had another one last night about on March 4th, the threatened 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico will be applied by the US. And on April 2nd, we'll see the reciprocity tariffs. All right, so what does all that mean? What's happened in terms of the second Trump administration? Well, the first thing to notice is on Inauguration Day, we got this America First trade policy presidential memorandum. Now, it's important to notice, us lawyers, that a memorandum is different from an executive order. An executive order has the force of law. A memorandum doesn't. And in this America First agenda, what we saw was that trade is not working for our workers. They are being harmed, they're being injured, not only by China, but also by all of our partners in NAFTA, Canada and Mexico, and by the European Union. And so what is presented on Inauguration Day is this reincarnation of first term Trump America First trade policy that we're really going to unsettle trade relations now. And so concomitantly with that America First trade memorandum, and I commend it to all of you, it really does set the game plan. It just tells you exactly what they're going to do, and whether you like or dislike that policy, at least you can give the players credit for so far doing what they said they were going to do. Well, likewise, we get executive orders in January on Inauguration Day, basically, to impose 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico, and 10% tariffs against China. Now, let's unpack that. The first question we lawyers ask is, what's the authority that the president has to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and 10% tariffs on China? Because the first set of tariffs on Canada and Mexico are illegal under NAFTA. NAFTA has created duty-free, quota-free treatment. That's true with NAFTA 1.0 in 1994. It's true with NAFTA 2.0, or USMCA, which Mr. Trump himself renegotiated, and which took effect in July 2020. So they would blow up NAFTA, these 25% tariffs. And the 10% tariffs on China, which are the only tariffs so far that have gone into effect, they would violate America's WTO commitments under GATT Article 1, the MFN rule, and under GATT Article 2.1b, the tariff binding rule. So why violate those commitments? Well, why is laid out in the America First trade policy memo. Those countries are hurting workers, they're eroding our industrial base, they're ballooning our trade deficit. We want to raise tariff revenues to fund income taxes. So you got multiple purposes. And I will say the fundamental purpose is the theory that trade is undermining our national security. If you walk away with nothing else from this talk, you should walk away with the inextricable link in the minds of America's trade policymakers today. That inextricable link is between trade and national security policy, and contrary to a theory that goes back all the way to Plutarch, that trade creates peaceful relations among peoples because we get to know each other and we become dependent on each other, and we realize that the foreigners are not barbarians, and we learn their cultures and languages. Contrary to that view, the view that has taken hold is that no, trade does not enhance our national security by creating peace, but rather the Horace view that trade corrupts our morals, trade spreads disease, and we should try and be self-sufficient so we can prosecute wars if need be on our own. That's the view that's taken hold. Now, that question of presidential authority then follows kind of logically from this national security purpose. It's none other than a Carter-era law, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977, the IEEPA. And those of you who studied trade sanctions and export controls will know that the IEEPA has never been used to impose tariffs on a target country. It's typically used to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat. That's the statutory language, an unusual and extraordinary threat that comes wholly in part from overseas. And the threat is to the foreign policy, economy, or national security of the United States. All right. So it's been used, as President Carter did and his successors did, against Iran. And it's been used in countless other international crises that fall short of war. Because if you're dealing with a wartime situation, declared war, you can use the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act. But in this case, in general, it's been used for conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., Panama, Nicaragua, but it's not been used to deal with a trade problem, and it's never been used, the IEPA, to impose tariffs. And so when you look at the executive orders from Inauguration Day involving Canada, Mexico, and China, the IEEPA is the presidential authorization. Now, why did the White House choose that? It's a clever choice. It doesn't involve a USTR Section 301 investigation. It doesn't require any public comment. And unlike some other statutes under the Trade Act of 1930 or the Tariff Act of 1930 or the Trade Act of 1974, there are no limitations. It doesn't say, for example, as one of the statutes says that, well, you can impose, you can raise tariffs up to 50% for 6 months to deal with the balance of payments crises. No, it doesn't constrain the president that way. So it's a strong arm statute that Mr. Trump has used. Now, Canada and Mexico quickly negotiated deals with the Trump administration to hopefully, they thought, to deal with the president's fundamental complaints, that the unusual and extraordinary threat was illegal immigration across the northern and southern boundaries and fentanyl or fentanyl precursors coming across our northern and southern borders. And that the Mexicans and the Canadians were not policing their borders against migrants and against narcotics. Well, it bought the Canadians and Mexicans a stay, if you will, from during the month of January. But last night, the president said those tariffs of 25% on all merchandise are going to go on March 4th. The only change will be, the only exception will be that the tariff on oil and gas from Canada will be at 10%. Now, you can imagine the reaction in both of our northern and southern friends. In Canada, and I am a dual citizen, I was born in Toronto, so I'm Canadian and American. There is a buy, B-U-Y, Canadian, and B-Y-E, buy American campaign. So if you go into alcoholic beverage stores across Canada, you'll see they've taken out California wines or US beers. And if you ask Canadians, are they going to holiday in the US? They're canceling their travel plans. And it's important here to notice how Canada does have leverage. Even though it sends something like 75–80% of its exports to the US, it imports as much from the US in value terms, almost $400 billion a year, as does the European Union from America. Canada buys a lot of merchandise from the US, and Canadians are the #1 source of tourism into the US. So they spend about $21 billion a year in the US. Moreover, Canada is a huge source of rare earths and other essential minerals that we need for dual use and national security. You look at the statistics about how the poundage, several hundred pounds of rare earths go into an F-35, right? Or into these beautiful little babies that we have all in our ubiquitous in our live iPhones. The need for rare earths. Well, a lot of that's coming from Canada. So if you go back to the statutory language, you say, well, is immigration or is fentanyl, is that an unusual and extraordinary threat? I'm not sure it's unusual. It may be extraordinary, but it's been going on for quite some time. No one has really challenged the president on that invocation. All right, so that happened on Inauguration Day. What also happened was 10% tariffs on all Chinese merchandise. Those tariffs have been levied. President Xi Jinping was rather muted in his reaction. He was hoping, I think, to negotiate some kind of settlement, and unsuccessful so far. Also, if you look at the managed exchange rate by the People's Bank of China, they can absorb a 10% tariff by allowing their currency to depreciate at least partially against the US dollar. Well, last night, the American president said, we're going to put another 10% tariff on all Chinese origin merchandise. So now it's going to be up to 20% tariffs on all Chinese origin merchandise starting on March 4th, in addition to the existing Section 301 tariffs from the first Trump administration and the Biden administration that are on about 2/3 to 3/4 of all Chinese origin merchandise. All right, so great. That's where we are so far as of Inauguration Day. Well, that was not all, because in February, we got another announcement from the White House, 25% steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This is a Kennedy-era statute. And the basic language here is that the president is authorized to adjust imports if that imported merchandise threatens to impair or impairs US national security. Well, in the first Trump administration in March 2018, 25% tariffs were imposed, and they have stayed on all the way through the Biden interregnum. But the Trump administration believes that the Biden administration wrongly gave too many exceptions to those 25% steel and aluminum tariffs. So they gave country exceptions to Canadian and Mexican, Korean and EU steel, and they gave product-specific exceptions on all kinds of steel and steel derivative products. So the result that White House currently is seeing is that the 25% 232 tariffs that were initially imposed by Trump 1 were undermined by the exceptions created by the Biden administration. And as a result, steel and aluminum production in the US did not increase materially. In fact, I think it actually fell in the US, and imports continued to flood the US. All right. So those are likely going to go back on, another 25% with no exceptions will go on pending a Commerce Department review, which is required by Section 232. And I think we know where that review is headed. Okay. Then came in February, I think, the most serious threat, and that's called reciprocity tariffs. And as you all learn in Professor Garcia's class, the existing WTO tariff schedules among the 166 members reflect a give and take of trade negotiations that started with the first GATT round in 1947. And so we trade lawyers, you, me, Professor Garcia, we know that it's a false narrative to say that because the European Union charges 10% on passenger cars and America charges 2.5% on passenger cars, we're getting, if I may say, screwed by the European Union. We also know that it's a false narrative to say that, well, Brazil charges an 18% tariff on ethanol, which is higher than the US tariff on ethanol. Why is it a false narrative? Because the trade negotiations over decades, almost 80 years, are usually cross-sectoral. For example, in the case of Brazil, Brazil points out that the effective tariff on sugar from Brazil into the US is 81.2%. So when Brazil sits down with the US in the context of a WTO negotiating round to ask for lower ethanol tariffs, they also ask from the US asks for lower ethanol tariffs. Brazil is asking for lower sugar tariffs. That's the kind of reciprocal trade that goes, a tariff negotiation that goes on. Likewise, in the European case, we may ask for a lower tariff on in Europe of 10% on passenger cars, and they may ask for a lower tariff on, let's say, textiles and apparel, where we have some pretty high tariffs on certain items. It's that give and take that is cross-sectoral that has resulted in the pattern of tariffs that we see in our tariff schedules. That's not what the White House is thinking. What they're thinking is just the raw numbers. If they see a difference in a bound or applied tariff on the same good, they think there's something unfair. Or if they see an average MFN tariff, let's say ours is, which it is, about 2 to 3%, and then they see India's much higher, something like, say, 25, 30%. They say, well, that's not fair. Because India's average MFN tariff is much higher. And forget about the fact that India may be a developing country. In the first Trump administration, all ideas of developing country, least developed country status, the generalized system of preferences, forget it, doesn't matter. In fact, the first Trump administration revoked India's GSP status. So reciprocity tariffs are set to go on April 2nd, the president said last night. All right, now step back for a minute and think about this. The pattern so far is we don't care about NAFTA and the roughly 30 years of North American integration that has created one of the most successful hemispheric free trade agreements ever. We don't care about the international rule of law that's been created across almost 80 years through the GATT WTO system. This is America first. This is what it means. And I'll pause also to point out a very different perspective in the 3 bar associations that I am a member of and participate in the International Trade Committee. If you talk to my colleagues in the International Bar Association, which is London-based, and that's the largest bar association in the world in terms of how many countries are covered, and almost like 200 countries. And if you talk to my colleagues at the Tokyo-based Inter-Pacific Bar Association, we have our annual meetings coming up in Toronto for the IBA in November and for the IPBA in Chicago. And they both have student memberships. I would definitely commend you to go to IBA and the IBA and IPBA websites. Those colleagues will tell you, and again, they're largely foreign lawyers, this is a nightmare that we're going to blow up NAFTA, we're going to blow up the WTO. For all their flaws, it's an overreaction. If the problems are, for example, China's made in 2025 policy and overcapacity in steel and aluminum and Chinese subsidies, don't blow up the whole system over that. Let's negotiate some kind of OPEC-style global quota system to deal with steel and aluminum. If you've got a problem in a particular sector, renegotiate tariffs in that sector, but don't destroy the whole system, which is also somewhat near and dear to poor countries. If you talk to the American Bar Association International Trade Committee, as I did yesterday in our conference call, they're much more client-driven. And many of the clients actually are pretty happy with the way things are going. They're not so wedded to the international rule of law architecture that we've created, that the U.S. has led with the WTO or NAFTA. In other words, to put the point more clearly, if the ABA were to try and develop a consensus paper that we need to stand for the rule of law on trade, it's not likely that the ABA could achieve that. There might, because of a considerable degree of sympathy for the way things are headed. Now, that's not all. Before I get to aggressive neo-mercantilism and characterize the paradigm, let me just point out 3 other tariffs on the horizon, all announced in February. The first are sector-specific tariffs. The president is thinking of imposing sector-specific tariffs on pharmaceuticals, autos, and lumber from all sources. In addition, he's said he's going to impose tariffs on countries that impose digital services taxes on our companies. Now, what's that about? Our GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon companies, they often have imposed on them DST, digital services taxes, by, for example, France and Canada for sales that they sales revenues and profits they make in the likes of France and Canada. They're not headquartered. They don't have any physical presence really in those other countries. They headquarters, say, in Ireland, a low tax jurisdiction, and the French and the Canadians say this is not fair. You make all this revenue in our countries and you pay no taxes. So the Biden administration had worked out a 2-pronged deal where there'd be a minimum corporate income taxes of about 15% that any country would impose in exchange for no DSTs. France, Canada would drop their DSTs, and lots of countries have DSTs, India, Turkey, etc. But we would agree to a 15% corporate minimum. So for those of you who want to see a tax trade interplay, this is a great topic to research. Well, the Trump administration has blown up that deal. So basically, no corporate income tax seems to be in the offing minimum, and we will hit other countries with DST. Finally, just announced a couple of days ago, the threat to impose tariffs on all imports of copper, because copper is essential to our national security. And the U.S. has lost its comparative advantage in domestic mining and refining of copper. Guess where a lot of that copper mining and refining has gone to? Yes, China. We don't want to be reliant on Chinese copper. So that's the stunning array, the dizzying array of developments that we've now seen catalyzed since Inauguration Day, and that catalyzing is, I suggest to you again, not ex nihilo, but the product of a few decades of evolution of frustration with a more global-oriented trade policy. Now, how do we characterize then the era that we're in? There's an article coming out in the Diplomat. It's a DC-based international policy publication. It'll be out in a few days. And basically the argument that I suggest is we are now heading to an era of aggressive neo-mercantilism. So this is to wrap that up. We're no longer, to explain that, we are not in that erstwhile paradigm of Clinton, Bush, Obama, of free trade or managed trade. That's over. Okay. The idea that Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the laws of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, which had been undermining, underpinning our trade policy and GATT and NAFTA and the WTO, forget it. Now that with Trump 1, basically with the Biden administration and with Trump 2, those ideas are now seen as, those free trade ideas of Smith and Ricardo are seen as undermining our national security. So we are back to the regime that, ironically, or maybe deliberately, Smith and Ricardo wrote against. And that regime was mercantilism. That's what Smith and Ricardo were writing about. And the basic idea of mercantilism was that a country, and let's use Britain as an example, would try and maximize its exports and minimize its imports of finished goods. So you would maximize, Britain would, exports in order to generate export revenues. And those revenues were, in those days, payments were made in gold. So the British Treasury, Her Majesty's or His Majesty's Treasury, would get more and more gold and would take that gold and invest it in the Royal Navy in particular, so that the Royal Navy could make the world safe for British sea lanes, commercial trade patterns to India, to the colonies, etc. And minimize imports of finished goods, rather rely on the colonies for imported inputs. Classic example would, of course, be cotton from India going to Manchester for making finished textiles, and then sending those garments back to India. Now you know why, if you didn't already, why Gandhi had his homespun campaign, that we should wear our own homespun cotton. So this was all about Rule Britannia. Basically, the great Canadian economist Jacob Viner explained that the idea behind mercantilist thought was nationalist. You were trying to give national advantage alone your weight. You didn't care about efficiency. Your idea was a nationalist driven, build your stock, your treasury stock of precious metals, run a balance of trade surplus, and invest that surplus in your economic, foreign policy, and national security might. Well, that's classic mercantilism. Well, we saw that mercantilism come to the US through Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers back in 1791, that we needed protection from the mighty British Empire to build our industrial base. And so it took on a neo-mercantilist dimension with Hamilton, that we would pursue mercantilism to build up our industrial base. Well, why then call it aggressive neo-mercantilism today? Well, partly there's a fixation on the bilateral trade deficit with China, partly because now the US is adopting its own kinds of industrial policy. We saw that with the CHIPS Act, with the IRA Act, and with other attempts that I think we're going to see in the future with the Trump administration to encourage, if not almost mandate, investment in the US. We've already seen Apple react the way the administration wanted. Apple earlier this week, said it will invest $500 billion in US plants in, for example, Houston, to make servers. And that way it jumps the tariff wall, of course. And we also see the neo-mercantilist strategy be aggressive because of export restrictions on, for example, advanced artificial intelligence chips. This is one of the few areas where this Trump 2 is actually taking and agreeing with a Biden administration trade policy. In its waning days, the Biden administration announced export restrictions on advanced chips that are used in artificial intelligence. And it's a very interesting way those export restrictions will work. It's not just on the number of them, it's on their computing power. And the Trump administration, without saying it, said, good idea, we need to make it tougher. So the point is, the neo-mercantilism about building the industrial bases is aggressive because of its targeting the trade deficit with China, targeting export controls, targeting these sort of geopolitical rivals, and pursuing industrial policy. That's far beyond the classic mercantilism that we saw during this, that Smith and Ricardo were writing against. All right, so that's the era that we're in. So now putting it in grand historical terms to wrap up and then open up to questions and comments. What the system, the global economic order, your global business law course, your global justice course, what you study with it, with Professor Garcia. When you look back a few centuries, we've gone from mercantilism to somewhat of a free trade system that came with the GATT 1947, to a managed trade system when we had lots of exceptions, for sensitive sectors, agriculture, etc. And now we're in this aggressive neo-mercantilist phase. And in this phase doesn't arise out of nothing. It comes with this evolution in American trade policy that dates back to several presidents and a bipartisan frustration with how free or managed trade has worked for the, or not worked for the American workers. And now we get the America First memorandum that I mentioned and all the announcements of tariffs. Now, again, nothing has happened yet in terms of actual levies other than the China tariffs of 10% since Inauguration Day. So you could say, and it would be a very good question, is all of this theater? Is this almost Shakespearean theater, to talk about law and literature a bit, that it's a threat? And this is sort of, if we think back, and I worked in New York, many of you are from New York, is this the kind of hardball talk that we would expect of people in the New York real estate industry, just to pick one, or on Wall Street? That there's the threat is going to induce compliance by the other side. Possibly, it has worked to some extent already. I mentioned what Apple's Tim Cook agreed to, and it the Mexican and Canadian presidents, Mexican president, Canadian prime minister, they tried to appease, if you will, the demands on fentanyl and illegal migration. But I think, as we all know as lawyers, if tariff policy is just about threats and it's overused, then it's not going to be ultimately successful. And I do worry that, and I did an article kind of using a fellow in Iago when we were going through NAFTA, the renegotiations under the first Trump administration, that the perception of America, the goodwill that we have enjoyed historically, has been seriously eroded. I witnessed that firsthand just hardly last week. It's only been a week since I've been back from Singapore, where, talking with friends and colleagues, asking, what is going on? Why are you talking like this to us? We are your friends. So let me stop with that. And thank you for giving me the floor over these last several minutes, and just invite any questions or comments. Now, in the interest of candor, we are going to stop the recording, so you can say whatever you like on the Q&A or comments, and I welcome your criticisms, etc. Thank you.